Welcome to Think Big with Dan and Qasim. Join hosts Dan Melnick and Qasim Masood as they explore big ideas, limitless possibilities, and engage with visionaries, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who dare to dream big, get inspired, motivated, and find practical tips for personal growth. Think big, dream bigger, and ignite your potential.
Welcome to Think Big with Dan and Qasim. Our guest today is Donald Lutz. So Donald, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us where you live and what you do.
Okay, I live in Spearfish, South Dakota, which is a rural area. I was originally, software architect / enterprise architect, and I've moved into platform engineering with Kubernetes. That is a simple definition.
Awesome, cool. So I'm curious about your background. How did you get into the software space in the first place?
When I was a teenager, I hacked the phone system fundamentally. That's what I did. Did that a lot. Then I ended up at UOS Advanced Technology, which was a research lab, and a whole bunch of people who had done similar hacking while placed in the research lab. And at that time, we were doing distributed programming and a whole bunch of. So I've always done that, studied physics because my father thought I should and decided that really wasn't the right choice for me. I was good at math, but, I never really knew what the math meant. It's like integrated into one. What does that mean?
Right. Well, I guess obviously, technology has changed a lot, right? Since, back when you were able to hack into phones, and obviously now we have iPhones, very high level technology. So I'm curious in terms of if you can kind of give us, our audience more an overview of, what you were doing way back when and kind of how that's pivoted to what you're doing now here in 2025.
Well, I always was doing distributed programming. It was a lot simpler. So I was always interested in how you can combine databases with operating systems, with compilers, with all those things. So back then I wrote a Forth compiler, a Tickle compiler. We created our own email processor that ran under Unix, not Linux, because Linux wasn't in existence then. So I've always been interested in how you build a distributed system. And I find that interesting because it's a combination of programming, compilers, operating systems, networking, and what we call today platform engineering. We didn't call it then. We just called it system programming. It was a generic thing. If you were building system programming, you wrote all the stuff underneath, and you weren't necessarily writing apps, even though you did write apps on top of it.
Yeah. So I guess as of now, right, in 2025, you're saying you're still kind of doing the same thing. Obviously that your role has changed. So what kind of industries are you working with and how do you help them?
It's across all industries. It really relates to industries that really want to move to Kubernetes, containers, and there's this whole idea in platform called an internal developer platform. So it's a different evolution from DevOps. It's the whole idea. I just gave a talk on this last week in Rapid City about, how do you build a platform that allows the developers to use self-service and create everything they need. So you have what's called a golden path, which is the idea that you can spin the things up that you need to do. It's different than DevOps because DevOps is really a set of tools, or an IDP is really creating software that allows everybody to do the things they need to do without having to know how to do it themselves. And people who do IDPs and platform engineering are software engineers at heart. DevOps are more tool users and system administrators historically the way it goes. I know my DevOps friends will be like, oh no, that's not what we do. But that's elements of that. And it is more tool using. And then you have to use 7 different tools and plug it all in. But also, the other thing that's changed is GitOps has become a principle in Kubernetes, using Git, and you allow that to spin up the things you need by pushing and pulling things too.
So I guess in terms of, you were saying, it's pretty much, across all industries. Is there a certain, company size or certain issues?
No, it's small, large, big. We build on something for the military. It can be across all because basically, but realistically, if you had a company and you were one employee and you had a simple app, you don't need distributed systems. I mean, you need to fundamentally be of a certain scale, and there is a push to have everybody run Kubernetes, which is not really a smart idea, but it's sort of, it has those elements of generative AI, everyone should do it because it's out there. It doesn't always make sense.
Right. So in terms of you were saying that I'm recently talking to people locally in Rapid City. So in terms of just from that standpoint, you're saying obviously people should have a certain amount of volume, certain amount of customers where it does make sense. So I'm curious more about those types of conversations. Where can actually these changes add enough value, help out the company?
Well, I won't give you the name, but there were a couple large companies 2 or 3 years ago that really were trying. They had, well-defined processes to do this. They were doing multi-cloud. So I've done a lot of multi-cloud. So, the plus is if you use Kubernetes, then the stuff you build works the same in AWS, Azure, and GCP. So it also helps them structure what they need to do. How do they get there? It allows them to map all their apps in there. It's super helpful. But, you have to kind of work on that process. What are you trying to do? Do you have a CI/CD process? Do you even know what CI/CD means? How do you deploy it? Do you use infrastructure as code? Do you know what infrastructure as code is? Do you guys do it? Or do you just run scripts? Well, we run bash scripts. Okay, so let's start. The problem is you have to go through all those high-level discussions to get there. It isn't so simple. You really have to discuss all those points. How do you do that? Why do you want to do it? And sometimes it's like the CEO said we must do this. So then the answer is much simpler. Okay, so you're doing it. You don't know if you want to do it, but you've been given an edict, so you're going to do it.
Right. And I'm sure you probably run into this all the time, but like a lot of people are not that technical, right? And they don't really understand the reason behind, this change or this, they really just don't understand it, So how do you kind of,
explain that? I sort of we get into I use some fairly simply building analogy. So basically, if you're building a large, skyscraper, you need a low-level infrastructure in the bottom so the pipes work, the electricity works. So that's kind of what you're trying to do here, whether it's cloud or Kubernetes, you have to build that up. And at the top, you have your apps, so then you have to start doing it. There's a great book called Architecture as an Elevator, and it's a book about how, you're building all these levels. So each level, the top level is where the CEO goes, so you take the elevator to talk to the CEO. So we're trying to make it easier for you to deploy all the things you need so you can deploy things quickly. Then you go into the next layer, which is maybe a sales group. Well, we need these things to integrate. We need Salesforce. Then you go down to the next level where you have the IT people. And sometimes, surprisingly, they're not as technical as you'd want them to be, and then sort of the whole idea is trying to get, and then you go down sort of to the software engineering level, which, and they say, well, IT won't let us do it. And then you try to correspond getting all those levels to talk. And a lot of times they use a thing called domain-driven design. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept.
No, I'm not.
Domain-driven design is the idea that you create what's called a ubiquitous language. So instead of just creating use cases, you actually define, what do you call this? And you make everybody if we call this Wizard A, then we all call it Wizard A. So you try to get everybody on the same. I did that years ago with a company called Greenbrier that wanted to modernize everything. And they had a lot of legacy apps and they wanted to do Kubernetes and the cloud. So we started working on that, defining what those are. So you can define, so then everybody uses the same term, because one of the real problems in these situations, the CEO calls it's not a wizard's chest, it's a rod. And then IT goes, no, it's some special fuel we put in there. And the software engineers, so you basically do this thing called event storming, where you get everybody in a room, and it could be virtually, and you talk about what all the definitions and how do we define them all, so we all call it the same thing. And there's a lot of non-technology that has to happen. I've always viewed myself as evangelist, getting people interested in how to use stuff and get excited, and I've done podcasts where we talk about it, I've done articles, but it's just that structure is the most important thing you have to do. But they don't talk to you for that structure. They talk to you because we need to do this really complicated technical thing. And then you say, well, let's talk about these other things and make sure you understand why we're doing it.
Right, exactly.
And it's a lot of fun, but it's also, surprisingly, the business doesn't fight you. IT doesn't fight you. Sales doesn't fight you. The people who fight you are the software engineers. They don't like doing this activity because they're like, well, and I think some of that is they just want to build what they want to build. So then if you impose this structure, then you're like, well, then we have to make it do this. Realistically, yes. And we always have that conversation. If you want to do cool things, you might have to do that on your own time, because the business isn't necessarily interested in the cool things you want to build. They're interested in how do they sell more things or grow their market share.
Exactly. So I guess obviously now in 2025, there's a big conversation around AI, right? So how does that kind of come into play, with what you're doing and what you're working on these days?
I use it a lot. I've been using it for a while. When I worked with IBM, I was an AI mentor. They did all these, hackathons and trying to get people to understand. It's very helpful to use. It doesn't, it doesn't just solve all the problems. I've used it for a lot of stuff. It can help you edit, it can help you do other things. You really have to come up with the initial idea. And then the main thing, like when we did the hackathons, you have to define, like with a simple prompt, you can't just say, I want to know about all the restaurants in South Dakota. So, okay, well, you need to say more like, I want to know about all the restaurants in South Dakota that have a rating of 5 and have Chinese food. And then you just said, you have to get really, really specific, because it'll hallucinate. It'll create answers you don't want, and getting people to understand how to use it. And there are different models. So models have different value. Like I created a model just to demonstrate it to the college students. It only answered about questions that were about Star Wars or Jedi. So any other thing they asked I don't know about that. Who is Darth Vader? Yeah, it gives you an answer. But when you ask other things, and I think it's super helpful. It isn't I'm still debating whether if it has really all the jobs were removed because of AI, or was it kind of related to the fact, and this is the supposition because I read a lot of things, was it due to the fact, a lot of the large companies hired a lot of people and they decided maybe they didn't need as many people as they hired. I don't know what the real answer is, but you can see some of that with Twitter when Elon went in and he discovered that he could build everything with a third of the engineers he had, which I think a lot of the high-end companies said, why do we have 20 of these people? I also follow, I can't think of the name of the book right now. It was a book written years ago. It's about engineering teams should be like a surgical team. You have the anesthesiologist. You don't need so many people. Because the problem is you have a team of 20. That's 20 times, that's 400 conversations that happen. Having smaller teams that can focus are better than sort of creating these, hordes of people, which don't result in things working.
Exactly. And I think sometimes when you have too many engineers, it's like, then you just, to your point, you end up just spending more time because they're kind of working in silo. Then you have to go back and it ends up taking way more time sometimes.
It does. The book was The Mythical Man Month. It was written a long time ago. Okay. It's a really good book. It kind of talks about all that. I read a lot, so I use that to supplement when I think about things. I read business things, technical things.
So are you seeing, obviously I think that many people are sort of concerned about AI. I think that there's a CEO that came out recently saying that in 5 years that most jobs will be eliminated. I think people are concerned about, or even people who are in school today, obviously you were talking about earlier that you're meeting with college students. What are you seeing just from your perspective in terms of how impactful AI is going to be in terms of just, are people going to be working in the same way that they're working now in 2025 and 5 years from now?
It will be impactful, but I think for engineers, if you use it as a tool, as what you're doing, it won't be as effective. And I mean, it's, people who don't at least use it to some level, they sort of on the path of, it's sort of like people years ago didn't want to use the internet, or all these have happened. So it's an adaptive trend. Surprisingly, the large corporations have not seen the value yet that they expect. The people who've seen the value are the various companies, NVIDIA, Anthropic. They're making the majority of the money. But then the problem is because of that, then various corporations say, well, if I build all these AI projects, then I need 10 people. But, there's sort of a weird fine line there. It's not going to suddenly take us over like Terminator.
Yeah, that's sort of, and I think also I think it was the CEO of Anthropic, if I'm not mistaken, but yeah. And it's just obviously, he's biased because he's building AI products. So, he has a bit of a bias there. But yeah, I mean, I do agree. I think humans are still needed. And, just to your point, you kind of have to find a way to work with AI in the best way possible, but it's not something that people are just going to lose their jobs overnight. And even, I think roles are going to change, right? For example, you might see a truck driver might still just be sitting on a truck, but they may be more of a mechanic, or an engineer just to fix the truck if it gets stuck in the middle of nowhere. But the truck will be probably pretty automated in terms of driving, but just the amount of time it'll take for someone to go and do maintenance or fix an issue, it's just going to be too much time. So you'll probably still have people sitting on the trucks. And it's similar, even you see trains that are automated, you still have somebody sitting on the train just in case.
Right. And I think, anybody who's an engineer, whether it's a software, whatever, you need to adopt it and use it, and figure out how you want to use it so you can decide what worked for you. I mean, I've kept a set of tools. I really like a Llama. It runs locally, so I can actually use whatever models I want. I don't have to put my data outside of my system. It's ideal. Sort of, I never was a fan of ChatGPT, mainly because Sam Altman he changes his ideas. We're nonprofit, we're profit. Maybe we're going to be nonprofit again. He's sort of got a different view of it. Everybody's trying to figure that out. NVIDIA has been the big winner, fundamentally.
All right. Yeah, it's interesting to see kind of what's happening and changes. And I think just to your point, companies sort of have to adjust. But as you said earlier, right, you're kind of in a smaller town. I live in Austin, Texas. My business partner's in New York. How are people kind of adapting in smaller cities in rural America, which is different than in bigger cities?
Well, there are companies in Rapid City, which is a larger city, about 75,000, that are using AI. Right. There's some consulting companies. I know some consultants who are using AI. I don't know where I live in Spearfish, realistically, if it's being used. There is a woman here who I work with who's bidding on AI projects, but she's not doing the work here. She's bidding on stuff for the Army, which is not here. It's not really here, but you see it in Rapid City where people are doing it.
For sure.
So it's hit, but it's like the average person in America currently. But they don't know there's when they're in Word, they're applying AI to it. When they're in a browser, they can be AI. It's magically put in every app now. My favorite part is I'm editing a document in Word and it changes the word I want to use for this article I'm writing. Like, no, that's not the word I want. The word I want is this. It is not managed. It's this other word. It's really bizarre. Like, no, do not do that.
Yeah, and I feel like that's what's been happening for a while. Even AI recommendations and SMS, iMessage, things like that, or when they're changing the words, there's a lot of these things that have been happening for a while.
Yeah, but it's just sort of becoming relevant. It's getting integrated in. It's sort of like how the browsers start and were unique. I remember when I was in the lab, I told my father-in-law eventually, because we were doing stuff with the cable industry and helping them create unique channels at the time, cable labs, and I told him, eventually there'll be specific stations or channels that'll just have content. And he's like, no, and this was 1996, and voila, it's true.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you could go back in time to before you started your software development journey, what is the one biggest piece of advice that you wish you knew?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think about this all the time. I honestly think, to me, the most important thing is the use of what are called the design patterns. They're more important than coding, architecture, because everything's built of design pattern. Because I use them to build out things like, I have what's called a singleton, one instance, a factory that creates things. If you use the design patterns, it makes it a lot easier to do that. And I used to mentor kids in robotics, and I taught them about design patterns, how it works, and why they're important. But most software engineers don't really know about design patterns. They don't even know about things like this paper that was written a long time called The Big Ball of Mud, which is about that if you build software the way you typically write a lot of code, it's like a big ball of mud rolling downhill. So when you pull the twigs out, 25 stones fall out and you don't know how they're interrelated.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if somebody watching this wanted to reach out to you or wanted to work with you, talk to you, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
LinkedIn, Donald Lutz at LinkedIn. I'd have to pull but I'm right there. You can find me.
Okay,
it's easy.
perfect.
I got about almost 24,000 followers. I post a
Awesome.
lot every day. The downside is everyone reaches out to me, but people reach out to me like, could you fix my problem? I'm like, here, you should go look this up and see if that helps you.
Yeah, makes sense. Awesome. Well, Donald, I want to say thanks so much for your time today.
It was very enjoyable.